Hello, everyone. My name is DC Segovia. I'm a senior researcher at the RP Group. I've been working on the multiple measures assessment project for a couple of years now. So part of this research today, we'll be talking about some data and results that Craig has been looking at. You want to introduce yourself, Craig?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. Craig Hayward, longtime member of the Multiple Measures Assessment Project research team. I think it's 7 or 8 years now that we've been working on this research thread. And the latest work that I've been drilling down into is the English learner assessment, placement, and throughput through transfer level English composition. And in my day job, I'm the Associate Vice Chancellor of Analytics and Innovation for the Kern Community College District. And with that, I think I have the ability to share the slides now, so we'll go ahead and post those up. Feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A if you have any. This is our webinar for you today, Investigating the Predictive Validity of Common ESL Tests, Maximizing Gateway English Throughput for International Students in the California Community Colleges. And I know there's been a lot of interest in placement tests, and multiple measures assessment project is happy that we're able to begin to investigate those placement tests, those common ESL tests, where they are still an option for placing students. So let's move into the overview of today's agenda. So there is a new paper, and we'll be sharing that link with you so you can get the full version available right away. We'll be giving you kind of the thumbnail sketch of it, the framing of the question around assessment and placement for English learners, and how placement tests have been used, can still be used, and then how we're approaching the question of the utility or the predictive validity of those tests in the post AB 705 environment. So we'll dig into the methods and the sample, how we put that together, our findings, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So the full report, as I just mentioned, is available. There's a short link there, kind of a bit.ly link. We'll throw that in the chat in a minute. This is focused on international students. So if any of you were on the AB 1705 webinar with Vice Chancellors Aisha Lowe and John Hetz yesterday, and Mallory Newell as well from the MMAP project, you'll recall that it's pretty clear that if students are graduating from a U.S. high school, they need to be placed via the default rules using a U.S. high school GPA. That applies to English learners as well. And we have a paper about U.S. high school graduates who are English learners that explores how to maximize their throughput as well. International students are a completely different sort of kettle of fish, if you will. These are students that do not have that high school GPA. So tests may be an appropriate way to place students. It's still on the table. It's still an option. Of course, in addition to the changes brought on by AB 705, we also had the COVID-19 pandemic hit not that long ago, and that really, at the shift to an online environment really changed how many colleges did assessment and placement. So that, as much as anything else, shifted placement of international students towards a more guided self-placement process than had previously been common. So we, in addition to the quantitative research that I'm sharing with you today, we also did a series of interviews with the participating colleges to understand more like the texture and the procedures around assessment and placement of international students. And so that's one of the things we learned. So while, there's tests are still an option, there's just been a movement away from relying on tests, even for placement of international students. So this second bullet point in the framing of this work is important because this isn't a kind of a classic assessment and placement paradigm or framing that you'll see in this paper and in the webinar today. Instead of being, which those classic paradigms really seek to find, if you will, the highest level of a sequence at which a student is deemed likely to be successful in pursuing or attempting. That's the classic way of looking at assessment and placement. In this approach, which is really just an exploration, it's a new approach, a novel way of looking at the value of placement tests. We're attempting to assess what these tests tell us about the likelihood of English throughput. So given student scores on these common ESL tests, ESL placement tests, what do those add to our ability to understand their likelihood of throughput, given the other factors that we know about those students, which are, in this case, the pathway that they pursue, whether they go into the English pathway or the ESL pathway, and then the level below transfer, how many levels below their initial course attempt would be or was. So we'll get into that a little bit more detail as we get further along in the webinar, but that's the basic framing or the logic behind the approach. Yeah, there's a probably question, which placement tests are still available? And we can share the link to the Chancellor's Office list of approved placement tests. So these are approved by the Board of Governors. Some of the tests, the vendors have really just exited the space, like Compass, and there were tests that were in use before, such as SLEP, which is actually the secondary level ESL placement test. And so that is actually intended for high school use, but it was a test that you would see used at some community colleges. But that's no longer, available as a vendor-supported test. Other tests, even from vendors who are still active in the space, are no longer on the Chancellor's Office approved list. So what that left us with was AccuPlacer and the CELSA tests as being the two tests that have at least provisional approval. And the AccuPlacer really, while we talk about AccuPlacer as a test, it really has 5 subtests, and different colleges deploy different sets of those tests. They maybe just use 1, or they maybe use 2 or 3. So we investigated those as 5 distinct tests, as well as conducting kind of an omnibus evaluation that used all of the available test information together, although that didn't really add anything beyond the analysis of evaluating them individually. Okay, so these are the 2 main research questions. Can we use these placement tests to predict English throughput, particularly with this sample, this population of international students that we're focused on? And then after considering the powerful effects, kind of almost determinative effects of the beginning placement level and the pathway, can AccuPlacer and CELSA placement tests provide additional power in terms of predicting throughput, additional significantly statistically significant kind of enhancement to the model that predicts throughput. So I've mentioned throughput a bunch of times. It's still a relatively new word. I imagine most of you on the webinar are familiar with it at this point, but just to level set, the throughput rate is the percentage of a given cohort of students, usually students who start at the same time or begin the sequence at the same time, who complete that key gateway course. So in this case, it's transferable English composition within a designated time frame. I should mention, we also include the transfer level equivalent ESL class as transfer level English composition. So that is also a gateway class. And some colleges are fortunate enough to have that as an option for their students. And that option is growing in popularity as well. So does this cohort of students that start at the same time, that begin the sequence at the same time, complete that course within a given time frame? For ESL students, that time frame varies. If they enter, or I should say for English learner students, if they enter the English pathway, they have 1 year. If they enter the ESL pathway, they have 3 years. And I see there's some questions starting to show up in the Q&A, and I'll be happy to address those. I think Daisy's probably going to tackle them as we go, or we'll just have some time at the end to get into the Q&A. So first I'll begin just describing international student population a bit. The large majority of students in the international students are coming from their Asian countries. And then the next largest would be Middle Eastern, North African, European group at 12%. We also have really a large group of unknown students that don't fill out the ethnicity ancestry questions. So we don't really know their background necessarily in the data set. So international students from the Asian language groups are the ones that are most likely to begin on the ESL path. So here what you're seeing is the proportion of students by their sort of country of origin or their linguistic background, and the proportion of those that enter the ESL path, and the flip of that would be the percentage that enter the English pathway. So you can see at one end, the large majority of East Indian students enter the English pathway. At the other end, the large majority of Asian students are entering the ESL pathway. So there's a very large difference. This is interesting because that initial decision to enter the ESL pathway or the English pathway is sometimes referred to as a black box because it isn't really a test in and of itself. You almost need a test to tell you which tests to take, but that initial determination is usually made through interaction and counseling with the international students counselor, at which point the students who come from either an English-speaking country or a country where their secondary education, their high school was in English, their high school instruction was primarily in English, would be typically directed to take the English assessment. Now, what we see, in the Philippines and in the East India, English is actually one of the official languages of those countries. Now, what we see when students enter those pathways is much higher throughput for students who do get on the English path, and this is true for students of all backgrounds. The majority of the international students who enter the English path start at transfer level, so that's definitely going to help their throughput. Whereas when students are entering the ESL pathway, there's more of a bell curve with students starting at 3 levels below, 2 levels below, 1 level below, and roughly equal proportions, and then relatively fewer students starting below 3 levels below, and not many having access to transfer level ESL, as that's still a fairly restricted option. And about 1 in 3 of its international students start on the English pathway. It's about 65% of students start on the ESL pathway. And then throughput rates do vary by your starting level. So the students who are starting at transfer level on the transfer level ESL equivalent path or transfer level English composition have very high throughput rates, and still quite reasonably high throughput rates for students starting at 1 level below or 2 levels below, though it starts to drop off as they get to 3 levels below, 4 levels below, throughput rates become quite a bit lower. As you introduce more time, there are more opportunities for attrition and other things to happen and intervene. So onto the current analysis, our data source for this work, because we use the Chancellor's Office MIS data, which is data that all of the colleges submit in a standardized format to the Chancellor's Office, that is then made available through a partnership with the Educational Results Partnership. But because assessment and placement data is not part of that standardized data collection system, we reached out to colleges with high numbers of international students, and an even dozen of those colleges responded and agreed to provide data, and were able to provide data for this. So they were providing actual placement test scores, the names of the tests that were in use, and that type of information. We also were able to connect with the 2 main test vendors that were being evaluated. So the KELSA and AccuPlacer folks were able to provide data sets that we used to backfill missing assessment information that was provided by the colleges. So kind of came at that from both angles. It was a big kind of data wrangling project to get this off the ground. So thanks to everybody who participated in that. A lot of real hard work went into creating this data set. So once we had that big kind of ball of data pulled together, we needed to go through it and confirm that these were really international students that we were looking at. So we confirmed their visa status. And at that point, we had 28,327 individuals in our sample. But again, because some of the test data that was provided were for tests that were no longer really relevant, there was also, just a handful of cases where, data was bad. We also needed to exclude, or for the purposes of this study, we excluded students who only took an English test, because we're really interested in particularly the ESL placement tests, since English placement tests are no longer in use in the system. And then we also needed to kind of prune some of the data in terms of the time, because of the 3-year window to evaluate throughput for students on the ESL pathway. The fall 2017 was the last term that we had a full cohort. So data that came in that we were given that was more recent than that wasn't included in the analysis. The ultimate final sample, after we went through all these hoops, was 12,117 international students. And I won't read this to you, but sort of included here for posterity, or if you're a real fast reader, is a table of the sample description. Oh, you can also get this from the full paper that will provide the bit.ly link in the chat, so you can get at that. I think one of the things to note is that a little bit different than our usual population. It's slightly tilted towards having more male students than female students, whereas in the usual community college population, there's quite a few more female students than male students. And we mentioned the ethnicity breakdown earlier. And most of these students, well, one other thing to mention, they provided their ed goal, and most of them in fact did indicate that they were degree or transfer oriented. It's a requirement, is a programmatic requirement of international students that they be seeking a degree. So we can take that as a given, but their own self-report on the application confirmed that. So another shout out and a thanks to the great colleges and the folks at those colleges who participated in the research and provided data to us. On to the results. Okay. And I apologize for the tables, but this is kind of the heart of the study, which is building models. And so I'll walk you through these. They're not too onerous really to understand. The first number that we refer to is the Nagelkirche R square, which is in bold up here. And this is a number that's going to tell us the percentage of the variability among students achieving throughput that's explained by the model. So in this case, 18.6% of the variability in throughput. That's a fairly strong model for educational research for social sciences. And this is based on simply knowing the student's starting pathway and their starting course level. We call this the overall baseline pathway attrition model. So based on attrition out of the sequence and because of the levels below transfer that they're placed, and based on the pathway, whether it's English or ESL, we can know quite a bit about their likelihood of completing throughput. That's absent knowing anything else about the students. So the second table shows us some particular values. I'm going to point out the column on the far right, which is really the odds ratio column. So the starting pathway, the way you would interpret that is that students who start on the English pathway are 2.796 times more likely than students who start on the ESL pathway to achieve throughput. For every level above the lowest level that the student starts in the pathway, they're 1.549 times more likely. So you could just kind of round, say 2.8, 1.5. And so that's the base model. And then another way that we looked at this to complement just the predictive power of the model was to say what percentage of students were classified accurately by this model in terms of whether the model predicted that they would complete Gateway English and whether they actually completed Gateway English. And this 2x2 table is the last table here, table 3. It's called the classification table. Sometimes it's called a confusion matrix. And you can see the number in bold. The overall accuracy of prediction was 66.1. Again, just based on knowing nothing more than which pathway they started in and what course level. So I'm going to move on. So that was for the overall sample. This is a very similar looking model really for the Accuplacer ESL reading skills test, which turned out to, in many ways, to be the, if you will, the best test, in that it had consistently positive kind of benefits over the attrition model. So this is the baseline model. So it uses the sample of students who were available with scores on the reading skills test, and then just ignored those scores and looked at, similar to that last model, what we would know about them, what we might predict in terms of whether they would or wouldn't complete transfer level English composition based on their starting pathway and their starting course level. And we have very similar numbers really to that last model, and it's the group of students is actually quite almost as big. It's almost the same group. It's a subset of that last group, but it's a large group. So we come out with a very similar model. 18.8% of the variance is explained. The accuracy is 66.2, which if we back up, you can see is, just slightly better, but almost the same as the overall baseline model. So the crux of the analysis is really contained in this next slide. And we did this 6 times. So there are a lot of these tables in the report, one for each of, or really there's 2. There's the baseline model, and then there's the actual model, but the test scores included for comparison for each of the 6 tests, the KELSA tests and the 5 Accuplacer subtests. And I won't go through all of those. I'm just using the reading skills test as an example. And you can see the Nagle-Kirky R-squared, the percentage of variance explained, goes up from the attrition model. So it's 19.6%. And then the accuracy goes up as well. Instead of 66.2%, it's now the 66.6% number. So this is why the reading skills test really kind of came out a cut above the other tests. It was consistently enhancing both the model and the accuracy of placement prediction, unlike the other tests that were evaluated. So I'll move on to just a summary of the ESL reading skills test scores. There were 7 of the colleges, the largest colleges, contributed cases to the ESL reading skills test scores, and they were significant predictors of throughput, even after we controlled for pathway and starting level, which are, such powerful predictors of throughputs. And then the accuracy was improved as well. So we had consistent positive improvement in model and accuracy when we added in the reading skills test scores. Now this is a summary, so we don't have to look at that set of complex tables or the detailed tables for all of the tests. This just summarizes all of the models and results in one table. So you can see the KELSA model. If we look at the model delta, it shows you the change. In this case, it's an improvement for the test model. So when we include the KELSA test scores, the variance explained went up from 10.8 to 11.8, so a 1% improvement. The baseline accuracy went from 63.9 to 64.5, an improvement of 0.6. The right placer ESL had a significant improvement in the model explanatory power from 25.4 to 26.8, and however the accuracy was lower when we included the test scores, so that we had inconsistent results for the right placer ESL, which is an essay-based test. Full disclosure, I was a little disappointed that in that result. I have to say, I felt that, with the right placer being an essay-based test, it had good method similarity to the type of outcome that we would want to see, which is, writing good essays and writing good papers and argumentation, but it didn't bear up consistently. The AccuPlacer ESL reading test, which we just talked about, it had consistent improvement in model and in the accuracy. The language use test improved a little bit the model, but no change in the accuracy. The sentence meaning score test didn't really make any difference when it was included, so no effect there. The ESL listening placement test looks like a good model. It improved the explanatory power by 1.2%, and the accuracy by 0.7%. But when you looked at the details of this one, the test scores were negatively associated with predicting throughput. So that is a kind of a validity issue for that test, that higher scores on the listening test should not be predicting lower throughput, and lower scores on the listening test should not be predicting higher throughput. So couldn't recommend that test either because of that issue. So a summary here, really, I think I've already said, kind of covered these key finding points, so move on. Yeah, I've covered the kind of the problematic issues with the KELSA, the AccuPlacer, and the ESL listening test. They initially looked promising, but a deeper examination each had their own kind of serious issues. And if you need to use a placement test, therefore, based on this evaluation, the AccuPlacer ESL reading skills test, may be the best test available based on its ability to predict throughput of students. There are some caveats and limitations on that, however. So I think we've already covered these recommendation points. Well, at least point 1. Point 2 is, if we're all going to continue to use placement tests for placing international students and English learners who do not have, other English learners who do not have US high school data, then it would be beneficial to sort of reactivate the MIS data collection of these raw placement scores so that we could do a better job as a system of kind of pooling our data together and understanding, what is, which tests and sort of which test score levels would be associated with placements that maximize the likelihood that students complete transfer level English composition, or the ESL equivalent. Now that's still, given the shift during the pandemic to guided self-placement and kind of away from using tests, and other shifts such as AccuPlacer, moving from the AccuPlacer Classic to a new updated version of its tests that frankly we don't have included in this data set, may cast some doubt as to what level of interest there is in continuing to use ESL placement tests to place students. The other pieces of information that would have been really valuable to collect but are not collected by the system, and they weren't really well collected by the colleges either, even though they are used by the colleges, are the TOEFL scores, the IELTS scores that are used to assess initial eligibility of international students to apply for the program. Colleges will typically have a cut score on those tests, but those are not generally collected as data in the data system. So they might just come through as part of a paper application or a PDF, and they're not entered into the student records. They're certainly not reported up into the MIS data. So we made an effort to collect those, but none of the colleges that we worked with actually had records of those scores that they could share with us. The other piece of information that would have been valuable, in addition to trying to deduce or infer students' native language from their responses to the ethnicity ancestry questions in the application, would have been simply to ask these students and know what their native language is. This is not something that's currently included in the application. It would be a valuable addition. Future research, I'll talk about that in a minute. But before, I wanted to mention some of these limitations. So, because the international student community is a relatively small subset of community college students in the system, and because of the way we were collecting the data, the sample sizes that we had for the different tests were relatively modest, particularly when you compare them to the analyses, the other MMAP analyses that have been done, where we have hundreds of thousands of students or even millions of records. Here we were dealing with only a little over 10,000, about 12,000 cases. The data covered a 10-year period. So we can't really say anything about relationships outside of that time frame. And then a big one is for me, is we really looked at 5 AccuPlacer Classic tests, but those were discontinued in 2019 and replaced with, so the conclusions that we're drawing here are suggestive. They're not directly relevant to the current suite of AccuPlacer tests, which have been revamped and relaunched since 2019. That's an important limitation. I didn't cover this earlier, but it's really important that we have the tests deployed at a variety of colleges and that they're using different cut scores. And when we evaluated that, it was the case that the same test score could result in a different level of placement, depending on which college you were at, or even sometimes in the same college. So that variability is important because it lets us see, if you got a 75 on one of these tests, what does that mean if you're placed a transfer level or 1 level below or 2 levels below or 3 levels below, and you have that kind of variability present in the data system. But for some of the tests like CELSA, they weren't as widely used, which limited some of that variability. So that could impose some kind of variance restrictions on the analysis, which would not, could be, negatively affecting the modeling. Of course, there could be uncontrolled differences among the colleges that we didn't include. And this is really, we only focused on international students. So if you're thinking of applying this to, for instance, the third group of English learners, sometimes we call adult ed English learners, students who come to the system, they're perhaps recent immigrants to the country. They did not progress through the high school system in the States and graduate, but they're residents, they're not international students. It may, the results may vary for that population to the extent that they have different background characteristics. So further research, and this is, I think, a really exciting area and an important area to focus on, is the shift to guided self-placement. And because this happened more or less en masse during the pandemic, it creates what we call a natural experiment. So with a little bit of time and space and data beginning to open up between us and that shift to the online environment and that shift to guided self-placement, it's creating an opportunity for us to evaluate how guided self-placement processes relate to students' ultimate throughput in the sequence and throughput to the transferable English composition course. So, next steps for the research would definitely be to dive deeper into the guided self-placement impact. So with that, that's the conclusion of my formal remarks. We've got plenty of time for Q&A. So Daisy, what have we got?
Sure, we got a few questions here in the Q&A. So first one is, what if high school graduates who are English learners opt to take credit English language, ESL courses at the community college? Will they still be allowed to do that under AB 1805?
Yes, students are required to be informed of their right to access ESL coursework. So they're not required, they're not, in fact, it's kind of the opposite. We are required to tell them of their right to access ESL coursework. So they're not going to be required to take the English pathway. We are required to give them a placement in the English pathway. So they have access to that should they choose, but they also have the right to enter the ESL pathway if they feel that that's the best option for them. What kind of placement tests are we giving? Sorry, Daisy.
No, I was going to skip because it was kind of related to what you're kind of answering, because it's more of like a compliance question.
Go ahead.
About what is the expectation for schools using the approved test with respect to the requirement of also using multiple measures?
So what are the multiple measures that typically the multiple measure that we see used when you're using for a assessment placement process that uses the placement tests is a meeting with a counselor. And that is a typical element of the assessment and placement process, and that counts as a multiple measure.
And then the one that you were reading is, what kind of placement tests are given to international students?
So historically, it's been a much larger number than what I covered today. So there were compass tests, for instance, and the SLEP, which I mentioned. But as far as what is still current on the Chancellor's Office approved list, it's CELSA and AccuPlacer, not really even all of those. have been approved. Although that can always change, right? It has to do with providing sufficient background information on reliability and validity. And sometimes what's happened is the vendors simply aren't providing that information. So it's something that could be changed. For the one that I can think of is the right placer, the AccuPlacer right placer essay test was on the list, and I think it just recently came off the list, and perhaps because AccuPlacer is no longer providing the required information for it to stay on the list.
Okay, next question. This person said, I'm feeling a little confused about teasing apart the predictions of sequence and level from the predictive validity of the instruments used to determine which sequence and level students place into. Are the predictions based strictly on sequence and level coming from colleges using self-placement? In other words, could I infer that self-placement is nearly as a powerful predictor as the ESL reading test?
I don't think so. Let me reread this to make sure that I'm parsing this correctly, Melissa. Which sequence and level students place into? No, so no, that it's not true that the predictions that are based strictly on sequence or level are coming from the same colleges that use the test for placement. But because of the variability in the way those how those test scores were interpreted and what they mean for level placement, the test score is kind of unconnected from the actual placement level. So that test score can show up at various different placement levels, which is the key to this kind of analysis. And so, I mean, I can answer that definitely. So the sequence and level models are coming just from those colleges that are actually using the placement tests. And so it doesn't really speak to the self-placement. And in fact, there really wasn't any kind of explicit analysis of self-placement in the current analysis in the current paper. That being said, you know, the large majority of the colleges in the study indicated that in the meetings with the counselors, right, with the international student counselors, which is, again, that is a multiple measure for the whole assessment and placement process, that students had agency. We are interested in potentially doing a follow-up study where we kind of dig a little deeper into these questions of, like, well, how much agency students have, how to determine their pathway, determine their placement level. But certainly they did have agency in those meetings, and they could express an interest in one pathway or another, or one placement level or another. But it's within the parameters, kind of the guidelines laid down by the test. So you know, what exactly those conversations look like in detail, we weren't privy to. But so there was an element of student not self-placement, sort of input into the process and self-advocacy for a particular placement that they might desire. All right, thanks, Melissa. And I think that's all of our questions in the Q&A.
Yep, that's it.
And Daisy's put the link to the full report there in the chat. So feel free to access that. And if you have any questions, let me know. If there aren't any more questions, we can wrap up a little bit early.
One more that just popped in.
Okay.
How are you mitigating counts from making students feel insecure?
Yeah, we're not. I mean, that's one of the, I think the follow-up analysis that we want to do to better understand what those how those counseling sessions are structured and kind of the level of agency that students have, level of input. It is more of a perhaps a qualitative analysis, but one that we could maybe connect then to, because if we go back into the presentation, one of the things that's clear is that there are differences among the colleges in terms of their average placement level. So some colleges tend to place students lower, some colleges tend to place students higher, and this is for students that are essentially the same students in terms of their scores and attributes, right? So there's a college effect in terms of the way they've structured their assessment and placement. And that could have to do also with the counseling, element, but again, it's a bit of a black box for us at this point in time. So there's no explicit, not in this current analysis, mitigation for, whether the counselors are making students feel insecure or whether counselors are making students feel empowered. That's just kind of open. It is what it is, and that's at play. Some colleges use. Oh, go ahead, Daisy.
No, I was going to read the next question. Oh, you were going to read it too. Okay. Some colleges use the self-ESL placement and self-place into ESL level, where you look into the successful rate.
Yes, I'm going to say yes. That's one of the things that we're really interested in. And we have, I should mention, there is an RP group paper that looks at guided self-placement practices in ESL programs in particular. And I'll see if I can't dig up the link to that and share that here in the chat. And it's more of a descriptive paper, kind of like, this is what we see, this is what colleges are telling us that they're doing. And so I think the next step is to kind of relate that to, throughput, like how do those variations in guided self-placement, and how does that sort of pivot to guided self-placement differ from a test-centric process, assessment and placement process prior to the shift to online. So those are some of the questions I think that we still need to examine. So yeah, thank you for asking that question.
And related to that is, do we know how many colleges are currently using a guided self-placement for ESL?
For ESL, no, frankly, I don't know that. We know that somebody may know that. I don't know that off the top of my head. We can look into. Daisy, can you think of there? You know what? That's a very good question, and I have a sense of it that it's a large number. Post-pandemic, there was during the pandemic, the shift to online, there was a realization most colleges couldn't have students complete those tests in the way that they had previously by coming in and having a supervised testing environment. So the guided self-placement became the most viable option in that environment. So I think it's a large majority of students, of colleges that have shifted to using guided self-placement. And in the numerous conversations that I've had with folks around the state, those that have made that shift aren't that interested in moving back to a test-centric environment, even if if that was made easy to do with clear guidance. So will all colleges be converting to ESL guided self-placement? Yeah, that's kind of you have to get out the crystal ball for that one. It seems, what would the magic 8 ball say? Seems likely. That seems to be the way it's trending for sure, Clarissa.
And I did add the link to the report on the side of self-placement and ESL for those of them who would like to take a look at that.
You are awesome, Daisy. Thank you.
Question up above here is, were the recommendations from this data analysis on how to improve the AccuPlacer tests?
That's a good question for the AccuPlacer folks, how they might interpret this as we didn't make direct, I'll say we didn't make direct recommendations to AccuPlacer on how to improve the tests. I guess the core, the implied recommendation is that AccuPlacer should be looking at throughput, and not just looking at that kind of classic test paradigm where you look at individual levels of a sequence and find a level where students are likely to succeed. That they should also be thinking about, well, what does this mean for that student's likelihood of overall throughput?
So it looks like that is the last of our questions. So I think we have about 5 minutes left to go, so we think it's a good time to wrap up. Just want to say that there will be a link for the recording that we will send out for that. So if you want to watch this again, there's also the links to the report that Craig wrote on the chat, as well as the Cytocus placement for an ESL report. And we'll make sure to send those out when we send out the link to the recording.
And thanks everyone for hanging in there with us today and for all of the great questions. Wishing you the best and have a great rest of your Wednesday.